Churchill taking a very different view. I mean, Churchill was not a factory owner or anything like this. Churchill was an imperialist with conscious all the time of the British Empire and the longer-term views of the British capitalist class. Churchill gradually worked on these members of the cabinet, argued with them. One of the tactics he used, every day he would say to them, well, you don't have to make up your minds tomorrow. Today you've got tomorrow and the day after, you see. And in the meantime, events were moving with rapidity until one day he was in fact saying to them, well, it's too late now, I mean, you're in the war. Whereupon Lord Morley and John Burns, the Labour leader, resigned. I don't think that Lenin had very much useful to say about war, but he said one very, very useful thing about the First World War. What Lenin did, he treated the powers in the world, Britain, France, Spain, Russia, Germany, and all the rest of them, he called them bandits. But he said there are two lots of bandits. First, he said, you've got the older and fatter bandits, the people who are gorged with colonies, don't need any more, and all they want is to be left alone. They don't want war, they just want someone to leave them alone and they would keep out of it. But he said you've got the other lot, the lean and hungry bandits, the Germans in Italy, who came along late and haven't got all these rich colonies. They're determined to challenge the older and fatter bandits. And of course, it was quite a useful way of looking at it. In 1914, Britain and France were allied with Russia against Germany. The Russian interest in the war is the one I've already mentioned. The Russians could see that the German plan, which they called the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, would not only open up Middle East oil to Germany, but would bring Germany into the Middle East, give them control of the Dardanelles, and bottle up the Russians in the Black Sea and so on. So the Russians had that view of it. Britain and France took the line against Germany for other reasons. But there is one interesting sidelight on this. The Entente Cordiale with France was signed in 1904. A few years earlier, Joseph Chamberlain, the Tory leader, had got a different idea. Joseph Chamberlain and some other leading, Cecil Rhodes was another, they got together and they had a plan which was quite different. Their plan was that Britain should not ally itself with France against Germany, but get Germany into alliance with Britain against France. And they also proposed to bring America in. They said, you know, if we got a triple alliance of Britain, America and Germany, we could conquer the world, and then, to use Joseph Chamberlain's own words, we could impose peace on the world, which, as you may realize, has a more modern recollection. This, of course, was the Hitlerite Germany idea too, only played from a different angle. But apparently the Germans weren't interested in it, and the thing broke down. So what might have been a war between Britain and France, Britain and Germany against France, ended up as a war between Britain and France against Germany. It's worth continuing this by having a look at what actually was behind some of the wars. There was that Boer War I've mentioned. These two smaller farmer republics in South Africa had their own wars against the Zulus, for example. The Boers warred with the Zulus to conquer Zulu land. But the powers were not much interested in these Boer republics until, in 1886, a discovery was made. They discovered on the Rand the biggest and richest goldfields in the world. Immediately, there was a flood of people, largely British, Canadians, Australians, into the Boer Republic. About 100,000 of them moved in a couple of years. Gold prospecting. Well, the Boer government didn't want this, and they flatly refused to give them voting rights. Well, of course, this brings you right up to date. Here's Britain interested in South Africa about people's voting rights. But, of course, it wasn't the voting rights of the blacks. Nobody worried about that. This was the voting rights of these immigrant white people into South Africa. In other words, the British government went to war with the South African Boer republics ostensibly about democracy, but of course what it was really was about the loot, the goldfields of the Rand near Johannesburg. Or take the wars between France and Germany. France occupied Alsace-Lorraine in the 17th and 18th century. In 1870, Germany went to war in France and got it back. In 1914, in the 1914 war, the Germans were defeated and the French got Alsace-Lorraine back again. 1940, if I've got my dates right, Hitler seized it again, and it took another war for the France to get it back again. Now, this, I assure you, was not concerned with the wishes of the population of Alsace-Lorraine. It arose out of the fact that it was very rich in iron ore, which both Germany and France needed for the rapid development of their iron and steel industries. Take a recent war, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. I've forgotten precisely what official reason Russia gave for doing it, but it's been reported, first, that Afghanistan is rich in natural gas, which the Russians want, but it's also been reported since then that they have discovered in Afghanistan, and the Russians are already developing it, the richest copper deposits in the world. Now this, of course, does make more sense than supposing that wars take place for the sort of reasons that governments give them. There are two popular fallacies about war that call for notice. The first has been put in the statement that the capitalist class have a vested interest in war. There is a very small element of truth in it. There's a small part of the capitalist class who make their profit by armaments. But apart from that, there is nothing in it. In fact, the reverse is almost true. You could almost say that the capitalist class, as a class, have a vested interest in avoiding war. And for the very good reason that the financial cost of war falls on the only people it can fall on, that is the property class. And in war, it's the property of the capitalist class that is destroyed in the vast destruction of modern war. Professor Bowley wrote a book about the First World War in which he analysed the wealth and income of the British capitalist class before 1914 and showed what had happened to it by 1924. It had come down very considerably. They were paying for the war. It was their property and their foreign investments that had disappeared. So, theoretically speaking, you could get the situation where particularly the older and fatter bandits don't want war. But of course, unfortunately for them, capitalism won't let them. There are always some expanding capitalist nations, like Germany in 1914, prepared to take a chance on winning a war and getting out of it rich rewards that would make the thing worthwhile. Now, there used to be an idea that war could be run at no cost because the victors make the defeated pay reparations. Germany did it to France in 1870. They tried to do it in 1914. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, used to go around saying two things: we'll hang the Kaiser and we'll make Germany pay for the war. Well, they never hung the Kaiser and they never made Germany pay for the war. They said the Germans were going to pay for the war, but it ended up with Germany, with Britain, America, France, lending money to Germany to save Germany from collapse. The Germans, in fact, never had to pay those reparations. And the cost of modern war is so great and the destruction is so great that you can rule it out of order. There's another theory that you're all of you met. It is that capitalism goes to war to escape depression. The idea is that the capitalist government, with a lot of trouble at home, economic difficulties of all sorts, goes to war to distract people's attention from it. It was very popular with the Communist Party between the wars, though I never heard them offering it as a reason why Russia got involved in a lot of wars. But here again, there's a small element of truth in it. Occasions do happen where a government in difficulties will go in for a bit of foreign adventurism, even if it's on a small scale, like making violent speeches denouncing a lot of foreigners. You remember that spate of denunciation of the Nones of Zurich at one time. And back in the 1929, the second Labour government, you had the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Snowden, suddenly becoming popular with all the press because he was going around making violent speeches denouncing the greed and all the rest of it of various European countries. I've forgotten even what they were. But that's the sort of thing they do. But as an explanation for serious war, it just won't hold water. There was no depression in this country in the 4 or 5 years before 1914. There was no depression in this country in 4 or 5 years before 1939. So according to this theory, why did they go to war? And the Labour government in 1950 got involved in the war with Korea. not only was there no depression in this country in 1950, but the previous 5 years there had been a continuous shortage of labour. So again, why did they go to war? Now, the element of truth in this argument can be seen in the Falklands War, but not in the sort of direction that it has in fact been used. The opposition in the Argentine parliament accused Galtieri of deliberately going into the Falklands War to distract attention from the desperate economic condition inside the Argentine. But Galtieri did not invade the Falklands because he wanted war or even thought that he was going to get involved in war. What Galtieri did, he'd been very badly advised, he'd been led to believe that if the Argentines made a sudden, swift attack on the Falklands, they'd have a walkover, and that the Thatcher government would make loud protests at the United Nations and then do nothing whatever about it. Well, he sadly misjudged the situation. It didn't work out like that at all. But it's quite obvious that Galtieri never thought that he was going to get involved in a serious war. He thought that it was just going to be a bit of adventurism. I now come to the question of disarmament. What's the chance of capitalism disarming through the various disarmament conferences? Well, a short answer is there isn't the slightest chance of it. The first such conference was held in 1899, and since then there have been dozens. There were half a dozen between the wars, and since 1945 they've been almost continuous. And we've also had the League of Nations and United Nations, and they've done nothing whatever in that direction. There have, I suppose, been a few minor achievements by United Nations, but you can see the futility of it in the Labour Party, which has always claimed that they, above all parties, were the party of peace. In 1907, the first chairman of the Labour Party, Keir Hardie, wrote about it. It was at a time when the second International Disarmament Conference was being held, and Keir Hardie listed all the important questions that a Labour government would have to deal with, and he said they'd give priority to disarmament. They'd solve the disarmament problem first, and then they'd go on to the other ones of poverty and unemployment and housing and all the rest of it. Well, I don't need to elaborate that point. Since then, the Labour Party's been involved in 2 world wars and a dozen others. It was the Labour government in 1950 which inaugurated the big increase of armament expenditure in this country. The reason they gave, as came out recently, they were afraid of that Russia was planning an invasion of Western Europe. It's also got a repercussion in June of this year. In the House of Commons, the Tory government announced that they were going to cut defence expenditure by 280 million in each of the next 3 years. So what did the Labour opposition do? They didn't say, well, very good news. They had down an amendment which read like this, that the government's actions were leading to damaging cuts in Britain's conventional defence responsibilities and Britain's defence industrial base. They went on to say that, among other things, the government was endangering the British Navy. They said the British Navy needs 3 new frigates a year, and instead of guaranteeing that these would be provided, the Tory government were creating a situation, and I quote from the Labour opposition, in which Britain would soon be without the capacity to build its own warships. And this is the party that claimed that they were particularly the party of peace and so on. One issue that's been constantly discussed among the supporters of capitalism and its wars is whether a capitalist country should have big armaments or little armaments. There's one school which quotes the old saying, if you want peace, you prepare for war. The other lot say, if your armaments are too big, you create fear in your neighbours, they get together and they may take preventive action and you're involved in a war. Which brings us to the Churchill family. Obviously, Sir Winston Churchill belonged to the big armaments people. Always Churchill was arguing for bigger armaments. But the strange thing is that his father didn't. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, in 1885 was Chancellor of the Exchequer in a Tory government, which was planning an increase in armaments to meet the threat from Germany. Lord Randolph Churchill objected, he resigned, and it ended his career. He argued, and what he said was this, He said the more heavily armed a country is, the more likely it is to get involved in war. Now, of course, they're both wrong. It doesn't matter whether a capitalist country is heavily armed or lightly armed, they all get involved in war when the situation is moving in that direction. Another thing about disarmament conferences, in fact the most important thing of all, disarmament conferences are not about disarmament. Disarmament conferences are about saving money. And it started with the Russian government finding the burden of armaments more than they wanted to bear, invited all the countries, all the powers of Europe, to a disarmament conference at The Hague in 1899. And I quote the invitation. It said, "It was to secure a possible reduction of the excessive armaments which weigh upon all nations by putting a limit on the progressive development of the present armaments." They held the conference at The Hague. They passed a number of resolutions, dealt with some things like poison gas, and one very interesting one, they dealt with the throwing of missiles from balloons. At least that is something we don't have to worry about these days. But the thing they did do, they set up a permanent court at The Hague to deal with disputes between the nations. It's still there, but nobody, of course, pays much attention to it. Another supposed way to avoid war is the propaganda of the various peace societies. There have been scores of them, starting with the Peace Society itself, which was formed after the Napoleonic Wars, to guarantee that it would never happen again. Well, of course, it's been happening ever since. And some of these peace organizations have not been specifically to end war, but to end the use of particular weapons of wars, like submarines or aeroplanes or bombing open towns or poison gas or germ warfare. And of course the latest of all is the CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, who want Britain unilaterally to get rid of all nuclear weapons. Their argument is that nuclear weapons are in a special class because they threaten the existence of the human race itself. They were formed in 1958, that's 28 years ago, and they particularly used this argument. They said, look, we begin this movement for unilateral disarmament. The other countries will be impressed by their seeing what we're doing here. They'll all fall into line and they'll all agree to get rid of nuclear armaments. Well, of course, it's been a total failure. There are now far more countries have got nuclear weapons now than in 1928, and many more of them who've got the capacity and the intention of getting them. And as regards the weapons themselves, of course, the collection of missiles in the world now is infinitely greater than it was in 1958 and infinitely more destructive. CND is also the idea that in a war, if this country has no nuclear missiles, it will not be attacked by enemy countries with nuclear missiles. They've got the curious idea that you are only attacked if you threaten anybody. They don't realize, of course, that what happens in capitalism, all the capitalist states, the 160 of them, are out for the loot. And if they find a country that, so I suppose is weakly armed and has got some rich deposits of platinum or gold or something like that there, that is an attraction to them. The CND people, of course, have forgotten that in 1945, when the atom bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japs had not got any nuclear weapons. In other words, they were a nuclear-free zone. It was not their fault, by the way. They had been working on the atom bomb themselves, but unfortunately for them, they were months behind. I've no doubt whatever, if at that point in 1945, the Japs had said to the Americans, the British and the Russians, a couple of hours after you drop those bombs on Japan, we'll blow up New York, Moscow and London, the bombs would not have dropped on Japan. But I mean, that is another question. What is interesting about CND, that unlike a lot of peace organizations, they are not opposed to war as such. They are not pacifists. Their present chairman, in an interview in the Sunday Telegraph, 17th of November 1985, described himself as a Christian non-pacifist. His founder of his church being the man who said, as lecturer said, thou shalt not kill. But he went on to say, it is not realistic to argue the country shall not have the means of defending itself. Now you see the choice of this word defence. It gives a certain gloss to this. Look, the wars we support will be wars to defend the people in this country. But of course, the conventional weapons they're talking about are the weapons of mass destruction to be used on all the other countries with which they happen to be at war. World War I was, so to speak, a C&D war. No nuclear weapons, not a whisper of a nuclear weapon, purely conventional weapons. And what happened in World War I? In this country alone, the number of people killed was 812,000, and the number injured was 1,850,000. And if you take not only the Allies, but all the warring countries in the First World War, there were 8.5 million people killed and 21 million people wounded. And this is what conventional non-nuclear war can be. In short, the CND are misleading the workers in their particular arguments. And of course, like all the peace societies which support capitalism but want to get rid of war, they are making the workers think that such a thing is possible when in fact it isn't. And politically, of course, CND every time they're challenged on it, they boast. They say, look, our members are Labourites and Liberals and CND and SDP people and Tories. In other words, they're saying our members are supporters of capitalism. Well, their members being supporters of capitalism, of course, whatever good intentions they've got, they are not going to do anything whatever to get rid of war. One change, by the way, that has been brought about by the peace societies, if you attach any importance to it, if you look up old records, this country used to have a Minister of War and a War Department. They've changed all that. He's now a Minister of Defence and a Defence Department. But of course, the functions have not changed. They're exactly the same as they used to be. I now come to the policy and actions of the Socialist Party of Great Britain in regard to war. We have consistently opposed capitalism's wars, and we have done so on the ground that the interests of the working class is not served by capitalism's wars. The capitalists have armed forces for their own purpose, and they don't set those armed forces in motion to serve the interests of the working class. You can say that from a working class point of view, we can agree with the statement made by Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin said, there never was a good war or a bad peace. Well, that is okay from a working class point of view. But the Socialist Party of Great Britain has never supposed, as have the peace societies, that you can prevent war merely by opposing war. Our case has always been that the only way to prevent capitalism's wars is to get rid of capitalism. During the history of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, we have seen in the world capitalist states presenting a variety of faces. Capitalism administered by imperialists and by professed opponents of war, by monarchists and republicans, by men belonging to all varieties of the Christian religion and all the other religions, and also by atheists. We have seen capitalism run by a particular lot, the zealots for free trade in this country in the middle of the 19th century, who argued that if only you could extend free trade to all over the world, this itself would bring permanent peace to the world. Well, of course, it didn't work. And we have seen, as I say, the failure of all the disarmament conferences and the League of Nations and United Nations. There is only one thing we have never seen in the world. We have never seen socialism in the world. And how and why, therefore, would socialism obviate war? Socialism will not be a class-divided society with a propertied class needing armed forces to protect its property and privileges. It will not have production for sale and profit. It won't be seeking markets or seeking sources of raw materials or having to protect trade routes or frontiers. It will not be divided into separate capitalist nations fighting each other. It will not have governments exploiting differences of language and religion to stir up national hatreds. It will not have class conflict between owners and non-owners, between the capitalist class and the working class. It will be organized worldwide on a basis of common ownership of the means of production and distribution. Production will be solely and directly for use, so that the only function of production will be to put things at the disposal of all the citizens of socialist society on the basis of free access. As regards the achievement of socialism, it involves, first of all, the winning over of the working class to an understanding and acceptance of the socialist case. You cannot contemplate socialism being run except by socialists. So that even if it were possible to gain control of the machinery of government and the armed forces without a socialist working class to do it, it would serve no purpose whatever, because you couldn't introduce socialism. Secondly, the socialist working class have got to be consciously and politically organized to gain control democratically of the machinery of government and the armed forces. That is, of course, to gain control of Parliament, the local councils, and the rest of the machinery of the capitalist state. In that way, and only that way, can the capitalist class be dispossessed and the road cleared for the establishment of socialism. In the words of our Declaration of Principles, socialism will involve the emancipation of all mankind without distinction of race or sex. It will also rid the world of war.
Well, thank you, Comrade Harley, for that very informative lecture. I think we're just waiting for the kettle to boil, so instead of having the collection after the break, we'll be quite revolutionary and take it before.
Yes. Okay. I'd like to ask Comrade Harley a question which has been floating around the party for quite a time. Is that, assuming that the working class had taken control of the forces of the state, including the armed forces, under what circumstances would it be necessary to use these armed forces, or would it never be necessary?
Well, you've got the question. The Socialist Party of Great Britain, in accordance with the Declaration of Principles, aims to get control of the machinery of government, including the armed forces, and the words carry on, to convert them into an instrument of emancipation. Well, the line always taken by the party on this question was, right from the early days, that you get control of the machinery of government, including the armed forces, most important. In other words, you deprive the capitalist class of their armed forces, and you use this as a means of dispossessing the capitalist class. Well, they always had to say, what's going to happen at that time? Are there going to be any people able and willing to put up some sort of resistance to it? If there are, of course, you've got to deal with them. And the sort of answer always given by members of the party dealing with it, I've got one in my pocket actually, a lecture given by Fitzgerald back in 1936, and he said they will know what the situation is, they will know what to do, and they will know whether they have got to, just how long they've got to keep control of the armed forces to do what they want to do. Now, we don't know. My own personal view is that no problem is likely to be arise, but we can't answer the question for them. They'll know what to do. If they are faced with any sort of difficulty, they'll have to treat it accordingly. But obviously, I mean, it would not make sense and would be contrary to our Declaration of Principles if our Declaration of Principles said, which it doesn't, we get control of the machinery of government and the armed forces and we mean to disband the armed forces. I mean, if there were the elements at that time able, with the means and with the intention of causing trouble, obviously that would be silly. I mean, and they just wouldn't do it. There is one further point about this. I was looking at a statement on this subject where it referred to the introduction of socialism. Well, of course, you've got to stop and ask yourself what you mean. Socialism, as a fully functioning system of society, means a society in which you are able to provide free access, where people can go and take out of what has been produced everything that they need. Well, if you look at what capitalism is like now and what it's likely to be, at that moment when you get control of the machinery of government and armed forces, you'll not be in a position next day to say to everybody in the world, there it is, you can go and take it because it won't be there. As Marx said, the first task of socialists when they've got power will be to increase as quickly as they possibly can the socially useful goods that people will need. And if you want to define it, I mean, you think you've got to be able to say that wherever people live in the world, there has got to be all the things that they need for life. Food, clothing, shelter, education, transport, entertainment, hospitals, all the rest of it. Well, to imagine that that exists in the world today is, of course, quite illusory. It doesn't.
Somebody else in the front.
But does not that presuppose that you could do without the armed forces? That at the moment of the social revolution, that there would be a majority in any given area all over the world. In other words, the conditions are exactly the same everywhere. Because I can envisage a situation where the majority of the people of the world want socialism, over 70 or 80%, but there are some areas where there will be problems, where in fact you may have to call in armed forces into those borders.